Section 1. A world divided, the Cold War. It was a time of tension. It was a time of fear. From 1947 to 1991, the world watched two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They never directly fought, but their rivalry shaped everything. It was a clash of ideologies, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. The stakes were high. Nuclear annihilation was a constant threat. This period saw proxy wars, it saw espionage, it saw a race for technological superiority. The Cold War touched every corner of the globe. It left an indelible mark on history. Understanding this era is crucial. It helps us understand the world we live in today. Over 100 countries were involved, aligning with either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. NATO, led by the United States, and the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, defined global alliances. Section 2. From Alliance to Suspicion. World War II ended in 1945. The Allied victory brought relief, but it also brought new challenges. The US and the Soviet Union had been allies. They defeated Nazi Germany together. But their alliance was one of convenience. Deep down, suspicions lingered.
Conferences were held in Yalta and Potsdam. These were attempts to shape the post-war world. But disagreements arose. The fate of Eastern Europe was a major point of contention. The Soviet Union wanted a buffer zone. They wanted protection from future invasions.
The US feared Soviet expansionism. At the heart of the conflict was ideology. The US championed capitalism. It valued individual freedom and democracy. The Soviet Union promoted communism. It advocated for a classless society. These two systems were fundamentally opposed. Mistrust grew. Between 1945 and 1950, there were over 200 reported espionage incidents. Key events like the Guzenko affair in 1945 and the Berlin blockade in 1948 heightened suspicions. The seeds of the Cold War were sown.
Section 3. The protagonists, superpowers, and their alliances. The Cold War was a global struggle, but at its core were two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Each led its own bloc. They sought to spread their influence. The US emerged from World War II strong. It had a powerful economy, it had the atomic bomb, it led the formation of NATO in 1949. This military alliance included Western European countries. By the mid-1950s, NATO had stationed over 500,000 troops in Europe.
The Soviet Union had the largest army in the world. It had significant influence in Eastern Europe. In response to NATO, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. This was a military alliance of communist states. The Warsaw Pact had over 1 million troops stationed in Eastern Europe. The stage was set for a decades-long standoff.
Section 4 Flashpoints. Confrontations that shaped a world. The Cold War wasn't a shooting war between the superpowers, but it was marked by crises. These crises brought the world to the brink. They highlighted the dangers of this ideological conflict. The Berlin blockade from 1948 to 1949 was the first major crisis. The Soviets blocked access to West Berlin. They aimed to force the Western powers out. The US responded with the Berlin airlift. Supplies were flown in for over a year. The blockade was eventually lifted. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was a proxy war. Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviets, invaded South Korea. The US intervened to support the South. The war ended in a stalemate, but it solidified the Cold War division. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the closest the world came to nuclear war. The Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba. These missiles could reach the US. President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba. The world held its breath. After tense negotiations, the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles. The Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975 was another proxy war. The US supported South Vietnam. Communist North Vietnam was backed by the Soviets. The war was long and costly for the US. It ended in a communist victory. The Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989 saw the Soviet Union invade Afghanistan. The US supported the Afghan resistance. This war drained Soviet resources. It further damaged the Soviet Union's image. Finally, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked a turning point. It symbolized the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Throughout the Cold War, there were over a dozen major confrontations. These confrontations not only shaped global politics but also had lasting impacts on international relations and military strategies. The legacy of these confrontations continues to influence the world today. Chapter 5. A race to the brink. The Cold War was a time of unprecedented danger.
Both the US and the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons. The world lived under the shadow of potential annihilation.
This was the era of duck and cover drills. The fear of nuclear war was very real.
The arms race was on. Both sides built up massive arsenals. They developed increasingly powerful weapons.
The concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, emerged. It meant that if one side attacked, the other would retaliate. This ensured that both sides would be destroyed.
MAD was a terrifying logic, but it arguably prevented a nuclear war.
There were attempts to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, was signed in 1968. It aimed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries.
The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, between the US and the Soviet Union also sought to limit the number of nuclear weapons. By the mid-1980s, the US had over 23,000 nuclear warheads, while the Soviet Union had around 40,000. Key events in the arms race included the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987 marked a significant step in reducing the number of nuclear weapons.
Chapter 6. Conquering Space, Fueling Rivalries. The Cold War rivalry extended beyond Earth.
The space race became a key arena for competition. Both the US and the Soviet Union poured resources into space exploration. It was a way to demonstrate technological superiority.
The Soviet Union struck first. In 1957, they launched Sputnik. It was the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. This shocked the US.
It spurred them to invest heavily in their own space program.
The US achieved a major victory in 1969. Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. This was a huge propaganda victory for the US.
It demonstrated the power of American technology and ingenuity. The space race had a lasting impact.
It led to the development of new technologies. It inspired generations of scientists and engineers, and it showed how competition could drive innovation.
By the end of the Cold War, the US had launched over 135 manned missions, while the Soviet Union had launched 89. These missions not only advanced technology but also intensified the rivalry between the superpowers.
Section 7. Secrets and Lies, the Shadow War of Espionage. Espionage was a pivotal element of the Cold War.
Both the US and the Soviet Union established extensive intelligence networks. They aimed to uncover each other's capabilities and intentions.
The CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, spearheaded US intelligence efforts. The KGB, or Committee for State Security, led Soviet espionage activities. They were engaged in a shadow war.
They recruited spies and conducted covert operations. Their goal was to influence global events.
Numerous high-profile espionage cases emerged during the Cold War. Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer, betrayed the US by spying for the Soviet Union.
Robert Hanssen, an FBI agent, also sold secrets to the Soviets. These incidents underscored the high stakes of the intelligence war.
They also revealed the vulnerability of both sides to infiltration. Over the course of the Cold War, there were thousands of espionage operations conducted by both sides. Approximately 60% of these operations were deemed successful, while the remaining 40% faced various degrees of failure. These operations significantly impacted global events and shaped the course of the Cold War. Section 8. Winning Hearts and Minds, Propaganda and Cultural Warfare. The Cold War was not just a battle of armies and weapons, it was also a battle of ideas.
Both sides used propaganda to win over hearts and minds. They sought to influence public opinion at home and abroad. The US portrayed itself as a beacon of freedom and democracy. It highlighted the successes of capitalism and condemned the Soviet Union's human rights record.
The Soviet Union presented itself as a champion of the working class. It emphasized social equality and accused the US of being imperialist and exploitative.
Cultural diplomacy was another important tool. The US sent jazz musicians and other artists abroad to showcase American culture. The Soviet Union did the same with its own ballet companies and orchestras. Both sides used film, radio, and television to spread their messages. During the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union each launched thousands of propaganda campaigns. Studies suggest that these campaigns were effective in shaping public opinion, with over 60% of targeted populations reporting a shift in their views.
Chapter 9. A numbers game. The Cold War was an expensive endeavor. Both the US and the Soviet Union allocated vast resources to their military forces. They amassed extensive nuclear arsenals and engaged in proxy wars worldwide.
This heavy spending had profound effects on their economies. The U.S. invested trillions of dollars in defense throughout the Cold War. It sustained a large standing army and pioneered advanced weapons systems. This defense expenditure significantly contributed to the national debt.
The Soviet Union's economy was less capable of supporting such high military expenditures. It found it challenging to match the U.S. in the arms race. This economic strain was a key factor in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. European countries also felt the economic impact, with NATO allies increasing their defense budgets. Developing countries involved in proxy wars faced significant economic challenges, diverting resources from development to military spending. Chapter 10. Reforms, Resistance, and the Fall of an Empire. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was in decline. Its economy was stagnant, and its people were eager for change.
Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. He introduced several key reforms. He aimed to save the Soviet Union.
Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, aimed to bring about change. Glasnost allowed for greater freedom of speech and press. Perestroika aimed to reform the Soviet economy. Gorbachev introduced over 20 major reforms, but resistance movements also grew, with more than 15 significant uprisings across Eastern Europe.
However, these reforms unleashed forces that Gorbachev could not control. Eastern European countries began to break away from Soviet control. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991. The Cold War was over. Chapter 11. Echoes in a New Millennium. Though the Cold War has ended, its legacy still influences the world today. The fall of the Soviet Union ushered in a new global order. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, facing new challenges.
The post-Cold War era has witnessed the rise of new global powers. Notably, China has become a significant economic and military force. This shift has resulted in a more multipolar world with diffuse power dynamics.
The Cold War also left a legacy of mistrust and division. The US and Russia, the Soviet Union's successor, maintain a complex and tense relationship. While the threat of nuclear war has lessened, it has not vanished. Nuclear weapons continue to be a significant concern. The Cold War's end has not erased its lasting impact on today's world. For instance, over 60% of current global conflicts have roots in Cold War-era divisions. Additionally, military spending by NATO countries has increased by 15% since 1991, reflecting ongoing security concerns. Thanks for watching.